Hello and welcome. This is the first lecture of English 1110 for the fall semester, and we're starting this class out with Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a text I always find myself returning to no matter what class I'm teaching. So this class is an intro to writing class, but sometimes instead of just focusing on how to write, if you focus more on the what of your writing, right, the content of what you want to express, the writing comes more naturally. When you get caught up in the rules and practicalities of writing, that's where we start to stifle our own voice and the ideas that we want to contribute to the world or how we feel capable of expressing ourselves. And I think that Kimmerer does a great job emphasizing the importance of storytelling. So in the beginning chapter, Sky Woman Falling, Kimmerer describes her experience as a university professor who teaches botany and ecology. So before I get into this quote, Kimmerer is just telling us a little bit about what her life looks like as a university professor teaching ecology and botany. So she says, "On one otherwise unremarkable morning, I gave the students in my general ecology class a survey. Among other things, they were asked to rate their understanding of the negative interactions between humans and the environment. Nearly every one of the 200 students said confidently that humans and nature are a bad mix. These were third-year students who had selected a career in environmental protection, so the response was, in a way, not very surprising. They were well schooled in the mechanics of climate change, toxins in the land and water, and the crisis of habitat loss. Later in the survey, they were asked to rate their knowledge of positive interactions between people and land. The median response was none. I was stunned. How is it possible that in 20 years of education, they cannot think of any beneficial relationships between people and the environment? Perhaps the negative examples they see every day, brownfields, factory farms, suburban sprawl, truncated their ability to see some good between humans and the earth. As the land becomes impoverished, so too does the scope of their vision. When we talked about this after class, I realized that they could not even imagine what beneficial relations between their species and others might look like. How can we begin to move toward ecological and cultural sustainability if we cannot even imagine what that path feels like?" These students were not raised on the story of Sky Woman. Right, so here she's putting the idea of institutional education and academia in conversation with indigenous knowledge practices, which are traditionally, from a colonial standpoint, seen as opposites, right? So she asks that really important question, what are we working towards in terms of sustainability if we can't even imagine an alternative way of living with the land? Writing is inherently political. So it's important to recognize that the stories that we choose to tell and the perspectives that we emphasize shapes our understanding of the world and our role in it. Kimmerer's work in Braiding Sweetgrass serves as a powerful example of how academic work paired with the simple act of storytelling can challenge dominant narratives, such as the belief that humans and nature are incompatible. And this type of creative thinking that defies what is academic versus what is not offers an alternative way of thinking about everything, right? That fosters a greater sense of responsibility and reciprocity and connection. When we write, we're not just putting words on a page, right? We're contributing to the larger discourse that influences how people think, act, and relate to each other and the environment. So by focusing on the what of our writing, on the content that carries our ideas and our values and our visions, we can create work that resonates on a deeper level, inspiring change and encouraging others to see the world differently. So in the context of this class, understanding writing as a political act means recognizing the power of your voice and the impact that your words can have. It's about being intentional with the stories that we choose to tell, the issues that we choose to talk about, and the perspectives that we amplify. By doing so, yes, we're honing in our writing skills, but we're also participating in the ongoing process of shaping culture and society. So just as Kimmerer challenges her students to imagine positive interactions between humans and nature, this course, I'm challenging you to think critically about the messages that you want to send out to the world. So in the section titled The Council of Pecans, Kimmerer informs us that the word pecan, rooted in indigenous language, symbolizes more than just a nut, right? It carries the weight of history and the nourishment of survival and the echoes of peoples who have been displaced, right? The author's ancestors marched from their homelands, left behind graves, languages, and names, and yet they found solace in these groves of pecan trees amidst like unfamiliar lands, right? So these trees, they were unknown, but they were bountiful, and they offered sustenance when everything else was gone. So Kimmerer talks about making this pecan pie around Thanksgiving or at Thanksgiving, and in crafting that pecan pie, that's not just her following a tradition, right? She's honoring the resilience of her ancestors who found hope in the fruit of those trees. She tends to the young pecan trees by her home, watering them in dry spells as if she's tending to the memory and the spirit of her people, right? The hard-shelled nuts, which are, she talks about, they're designed to be stored for the winter. They're not proficient in this language of instant gratification. So for these trees to ensure the survival of their own species, Kimmerer talks about that they don't act alone, right? Instead, these trees participate in a grand communal rhythm known as massed fruiting. So this collective strategy requires every tree to save up energy, much like, she says, a family saving up for a special occasion, until the moment is right to produce a surplus of nuts, more than any predator could possibly consume. And that's how they ensure their survival. These pecan trees teach us that flourishing isn't an individual endeavor, right? It's a collective one. So if a single tree were to produce a bunch of nuts on its own, its efforts might be in vain, because the few nuts that it creates would be eaten, leaving no chance of survival for the next generation of trees. But when they act in unison, they overwhelm the predators, ensuring that at least some of their seeds escape and grow into new life, right? So this is not just survival, it is mutual flourishing. So the trees, the squirrels, the hawks, even people who gather the nuts, we all are participating in this dance of flourishing where each one of us plays a part in the survival of the other, right? So we've heard the phrase survival of the fittest, and that kind of gives off this very individualistic notion and understanding of survival. But this communal generosity where trees give in abundance sort of seems at odds with that evolutionary notion of individual survival. But the truth is, the well-being of one is deeply tied to the well-being of all. And that's what she's saying in this book. The trees ensure their survival by supporting the entire ecosystem, knowing that their abundance feeds the very creatures who in turn protect and disperse their seeds, right? So it's a lesson of interdependence. And Kimmerer talks about that we don't quite know the how, but we can understand the why, right? We also can relate to that. Our words and our stories find strength in their connection to others, right? When we tell a story and it resonates or it impacts someone, that is how we thrive. Our individual well-being is bound to the health of our communities and our environments. So in this way, the story of massed fruiting becomes a powerful metaphor for our own lives and the very act of writing. So writing is not a solitary act, but a communal one, where the ideas that we share and the stories that we tell contribute to a larger narrative that sustains all of us, right? Through this collective creativity, we can ensure that our words, like the pecan seeds, will take root and grow, carrying forward the wisdom that we want to offer from the past into the future. So this story reminds us that writing, like the pecan, is a vessel of survival. The act of writing becomes an act of remembering and honoring and of survival, right? Writing is an offering. So she recounts her childhood experiences with family rituals that aimed to honor the land. So for instance, before leaving a camping spot, her mother made sure that it was left spotless and prepared wood for future visitors, creating that legacy of mutual respect and mutual care. So these rituals, they served as these tangible expressions of gratitude and connection to the earth and to each other. Kimmerer reflects on how these rituals, though they're not rooted in a direct ancestral lineage, so to speak, they became deeply significant, right? They evolved from simple acts like pouring the first cup of coffee out onto the ground to clear the spout into meaningful gestures of gratitude. So despite initial doubts of the authenticity of these ceremonies, Kimmerer comes to realize that the true essence of ceremony lies not in its historical purity, but in its ability to transform the ordinary into the sacred. It's this transformation that creates a bridge between mundane actions and deep spiritual respect. So as writers, we also have the power to turn everyday experiences into impactful narratives. So this process is more than just describing events. It's about describing the significance of those events to you and to your community and connecting these events to other events, right? Perhaps historical, perhaps in the future. But we're talking about larger themes of human experience and emotion. So Kimmerer's story highlights the importance of finding meaning in the ordinary and recognizing that even the simplest actions can carry profound significance. So when I hear students say that they don't feel confident with writing, it's usually not about the writing at all once they actually start explaining their experience with writing. It's more of a lack of confidence in what they have to say, as if nothing they write will possibly have the significance for anyone to want to read it. But whether you're writing something in a secret diary or in a published book, Kimmerer's discussion of offerings encourages us to view writing as a form of ceremony, a way to honor and make sense of our personal and shared experiences. Writing is an offering. So again, before we get into the logistics of academic writing, we have to first prioritize what in the world we want to say. So when Kimmerer talks about ceremonies and she says that true essence of ceremony is not necessarily its historical purity, but its ability to transform the ordinary into the sacred, that's how I feel about writing. Right? Writing, it's not about the academic purity of it. I don't think anyone wants to read that, quite frankly, but it's in its ability to transform the reader, right? And the reader's perspective on the world. So in the beginning of learning the grammar of animacy, which is the final chapter, I guess you could say, of the planting sweetgrass section, she's talking about sitting in nature, sitting outside and just listening to all of the languages happening that are not her own language. I'm going to read a couple paragraphs. I come here to listen, to nestle in the curve of the roots in a soft hollow of pine needles, to lean my bones against the column of white pine, to turn off the voice in my head until I can hear the voices outside it. The shh of wind and needles, water trickling over rock, nuthatch tapping, chipmunks digging, beech nut falling, mosquito in my ear, and something more, something that is not me, for which we have no language, the wordless being of others, in which we are never alone. After the drumbeat of my mother's heart, this was my first language. Then she goes on, listening in wild places, we are audience to conversations in a language not our own. I think now that it was a longing to comprehend this language that I hear in the woods that led me to science, to learn over the years to speak fluent botany. A tongue that should not, by the way, be mistaken for the language of plants. I did learn another language in science, though, one of careful observation, an intimate vocabulary that names each little part. To name and describe, you must first see, and science polishes the gift of seeing. I honor the strength of the language that has become a second tongue to me. But beneath the richness of its vocabulary and its descriptive power, something is missing. The same something that swells around you and in you when you listen to the world. Science can be a language of distance, which reduces a being to its working parts. It is a language of objects. The language scientists speak, however precise, is based on a profound error in grammar, an omission, a grave loss in translation from the native languages of these stories. So then she goes on to talk about her experience learning Potawatomi, her indigenous language. And she says to learn, you have to really listen, right? To actually speak, of course, requires verbs. And here is where my kindergarten proficiency at naming things leaves off. English is a noun-based language, somehow appropriate to a culture so obsessed with things. Only 30% of English words are verbs, but in Potawatomi, that proportion is 70%. Which means that 70% of the words have to be conjugated and 70% have different tenses and cases to be mastered. European languages often assign gender to nouns, but Potawatomi does not divide the world into masculine and feminine. Nouns and verbs are both animate and inanimate. And then she says, no wonder there are only 9 speakers left. 9. There are 9 speakers left. I try, but the complexity makes my head hurt, and my ear can barely distinguish the words that mean completely different things. One teacher reassures us that this will come with practice, but another elder concedes that those close similarities are inherent in the language. She goes on to continue to speak about her frustration with trying to learn this language, which I hope that we can remember to revisit when we talk about Gloria Anzaldua's How to Tame a Wild Tongue, because just as I'm rereading this section right now for the purpose of recording this lecture, I feel myself getting a bit emotional about the connections between my family losing our language and Kimmerer's storytelling here. She gets so frustrated. She says, I was feeling that this was just way too hard. The threads in my brain knotted, and the harder I tried, the tighter they became. Pages blurred, and my eyes settled on a word, a verb, of course, to be a Saturday. Pfft. I threw down the book. Since when is Saturday a verb? Everyone knows it's a noun. I grabbed the dictionary and flipped more pages, and all kinds of things seemed to be verbs. To be a hill, to be red, to be a long sandy stretch of beach. And then my finger rested on to be a bay. Ridiculous, I ranted in my head. There is no reason to make it so complicated. No wonder no one speaks it. A cumberstone language, impossible to learn, and more than that, it's all wrong. A bay is most definitely a person, place, or thing, a noun, and not a verb. I was ready to give up. I'd learned a few words, done my duty to the language that was taken from my grandfather. Oh, the ghosts of the missionaries in the boarding schools must have been rubbing their hands in glee at my frustration. She's going to surrender, they said. In that moment, I could smell the water of the bay, Watch it rock against the shore and hear it sift onto the sand. A bay is a noun only if water is dead. When bay is a noun, it is defined by humans, trapped between its shores and contained by the word. But the verb to be a bay releases the water from bondage and lets it live. To be a bay holds the wonder that for this moment, the living water has decided to shelter itself between these shores, conversing with cedar roots because it could do otherwise, become a stream or an ocean or a waterfall, and there are verbs for that too. To be a hill, to be a sandy beach, to be a Saturday are all possible verbs in a world where everything is alive. Water, land, and even a day, the language, a mirror for seeing the animacy of the world. The life that pulses through all things, through pines and nuthatches and mushrooms. This is the language I hear in the woods. This is the language that lets us speak of what wells up around us. And the vestiges of boarding schools, the soap-wielding missionary wraiths, hang their heads in defeat. This is the grammar of animacy, right? So she's reflecting on her journey of learning to speak the language of science as a means to understand the natural world. She describes this language as a form of communication that, while it is precise and rich in its own right, can sometimes miss the essence of what it is actually seeking to describe, right? The essence. So Kimmerer contrasts this scientific language, which breaks down living beings into their parts, right? As if they are objects. She contrasts that with Potawatomi, which is a language that describes almost everything as living. And she says that Potawatomi offers that language that she hears, that she's looking for, that science wants to describe. A sense that comes from listening deeply to nature and its inherent language and the language of the peoples that are indigenous to that place, right? So she acknowledges that the scientific approach, with its focus on observation and detailed description, it has sharpened her ability to see and understand the natural world, and she has gratitude for that, right? But she also notes that this language is limited, and it often reduces the complexity of life into mere objects and processes. And this reductionism, according to Kimmerer, represents a significant loss, a failure to fully capture the vibrant living essence of the beings that they're studying in science. So Kimmerer emphasizes that while science is a valuable tool, it's not the only way to engage with the natural world. And also, she's not putting these in a dichotomy. This one's better than that one. She's saying they offer different things, and it's okay to acknowledge that both things are worth looking into, at the very least, right? But she says that there's something deeper, a richness that is felt when we listen to the environment in a more intuitive and less analytical way, rather than rejecting the subjective for the objective, right? Subjective is based on the person. It is something that you cannot necessarily prove, while objective is that mythical sense of distance between the observer and the observed, right? So that missing element reflects a gap between the scientific language of objects and the more profound animate language of living systems. So for academic writing, while it is precise and structured and well-researched, it sometimes lacks the emotional depth and nuance found in more creative or narrative-based forms, right? It can sound robotic and disconnected and sometimes even performative, right? There's times that I read as a scholar, as someone who is in the final stretch of their PhD, I also have the experience of reading an academic work and feeling like the author did not care as much about helping me understand what they're trying to say, walking me through it, as much as they wanted me to believe that they're smart, right? And I think that in that way, academic writing can be performative, right? There's a lot of times that we read the writing of scholars across the world who seem to care more about seeming intelligent to their colleagues than actually making their work accessible to the public. And I am not going to teach that type of writing, right? Kimmerer is an ecologist, a botanist, a scientist. And if you read this work, it does not read like science, but it is, right? There is science in it. But because it is not written as if it's this detached, emotionless, scientific language, I personally can retain more, right? What she's saying matters more. And so I can handle it with more care because she has given more of herself in this writing. It is a political decision for Kimmerer to put Potawatomi in conversation with scientific language, especially considering the colonial roots of academia. Potawatomi is not meant to show up in academic work. That was the whole point of the boarding schools that she's talking about, where languages were intentionally erased. Students were punished for speaking that language. So like the pecan trees that give generously to their environment, your work has the potential to be a sort of offering to your community. Braiding Sweetgrass, part of the reason I'm always returning to it when I'm teaching, and I think it's a great way to start out the semester, is because it really does challenge a lot of what we consider to be this academic versus lived experience binary, right? As if your whole self is not welcome in the Western education system, and you have to fracture off parts of yourself in order to be successful in the academic world. But Kimmerer kind of proves that's not true, right? She's not saying that it's one or the other, but she's saying there are ways to do academic writing that do not deny your whole personhood. Kimmerer says that some of my ancestors are Sky Woman's people, and I belong to them. Some of my ancestors were the newer kind of immigrants too. A French fur trader, an Irish carpenter, a Welsh farmer, and here we all are on Turtle Island trying to make a home. Right? So she is in part indigenous, part European, and she has this really unique perspective on the Potawatomi language, for example, and the scientific language. And this is such a valuable contribution. And in the book, she talks about all of the people that she talked to that told her she wasn't allowed to do that kind of work. The language of botany brought her to learn or want to learn Potawatomi. She uses her unique worldviews and her unique experiences to enhance the science that she's doing. Right? And because she is able to write about the science in a way that is inviting rather than that performative bullshit, right? We're able to retain a lot more and it can resonate deeper. So this book is always, I would say, one of the greatest offerings to the academic world, to the non-academic world, the world in general. We're going to be sticking with this a couple more weeks, so I can't wait to see what you got. Remember, this week we're focused on planting sweetgrass, which is all of these sections: Sky Woman Falling, the Council of Pecans, the Gift of Strawberries, an Offering, Asters and Goldenrod, and Learning the Grammar of Animacy. Those are all of the chapters in the section that we're reading. It's just about 50-ish pages, a little bit over 50 pages. Okay, and then next week we're reading the Tending Sweetgrass section. So Braiding Sweetgrass is actually available on Spotify with the author herself reading it. So if you are a Spotify fan, go ahead and check that out. I recommend listening to your lectures or to the Braiding Sweetgrass audiobook while on a walk. I went into a little bit more depth in my first ever episode called Sci-Fi as Restoration, where I talk about that opening Sky Woman Falling excerpt. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, go ahead and check it out. Otherwise, I'll see you back here next week.